Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
Welcome everyone to another episode of L&D Disrupt Live. Pleased to say that this week we're joined by Sara Stevick. Sara is an L&D leader, strategist and technologist. If you joined early, you would have heard that she also has a background in teaching, which is obviously gives you quite an interesting insight into the world of L&D as well, I'd imagine. But also you've occupied learning roles at Capital One and Wayfair. So Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So I think one thing that we obviously wanted to talk about today was how you can build an impact culture in learning that everyone can get behind. But I guess part of that comes down to sort of how well researched your strategy is, whether you can communicate the value of your strategy to non-L&D people. And I know you have sort of experience in analysis of where opportunities for learning can be sort of improved and leveraged in companies. So yeah, how can we go about that as L&D teams?
So I think it's really important to kind of preface this whole conversation with learning culture is in no way just built by L&D teams. Learning culture cannot be developed solely by one entity at a company. It's a whole company-wide effort. And I think that's where a lot of misconception stems from, especially initially. Because when we hear learning culture, we're like, oh, well, that's related to the L&D department. That's where I want to start. And so they'll take care of it. And this is often what permeates into the business mindset as well is, oh, learning culture, they want to learn. We're going to put it in the hands of the L&D team and they'll have everything they need automatically, wave a magic wand and ta-da, learning culture. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, right? Josh Bersin has done an extensive amount of research and has published a lot of different papers and articles and research to kind of talk about the multifaceted ways to develop all the different elements needed for a high impact culture, organizational culture. And part of that is learning culture. So I did want to really preface with that is that a lot of what we're going to be talking about here is how to kind of bring that awareness up because that is something that is often a gap. So with that being said, really need to start identifying why you want to talk about learning culture, what is your endeavor, and what's going on with it currently. So you can't improve something if you don't know its current status. So I always encourage to do a lot of analytics right off the bat. And so you want to kind of identify and outline what that learning culture looks like within the company. And to do that, you kind of have to have several different tiers and several different personas that you're looking at. You want to dig in deep to what is the perception within the L&D department of learning culture to see if it's going to align with what is the perception within the corporate culture and what is the perception of the L&D within the actual target audience of your different learnings. And there will probably be quite a bit of discrepancy between those. And there's a couple different ways that you can go about doing this. On the learning department side, when we went about this at my most recent company, I proposed that we did SWOT analysis and really kind of break it down, like what are some issues that you're seeing? What are some challenges? What are some opportunities? What's going really well? Because that's part of current is what's going really well and what's kind of not, right? And then when you're targeting your audience from outside of that kind of internal L&D circle, that internal teams that work with L&D pretty closely, maybe like your UX, you would do SWOT analysis, maybe your project management teams, those kinds of things. But then you would want to do a survey, right? And the one that I would recommend would be the dimensions of learning organization questionnaire, the DLQOQ, survey. It has a lot of really great science behind it. It's 42 questions, but you can choose to give a 21 question version of it. But in order to keep the statistic validity, you do have to use either the 42 or the 21 to kind of get that baseline measurement and start painting a holistic picture of where you're at currently. And that's where you can kind of start to build from there as your strategy.
I suppose something you made me think about there is a lot of the time we do say start with numbers, but it's kind of a combination of two things. What are the numbers saying and what are the perceptions saying? Because if someone already has a perception of you and it's hard to shift that, they might not even listen to the numbers. So I guess it's about, as we've spoken about before, Nelson, a mix of anecdotal and sort of like statistical, empirical evidence, isn't it?
Oh, for
Yeah,
sure.
definitely.
Oh, go ahead, Nelson.
No, I was just going to add to what you're saying around the kind of learning culture piece. The chances are every organization has a learning culture, right? The question is whether you know about it or not. And if you don't know about it, then it possibly isn't a great one, or at least people perceive it not to be a great one or an effective one or a highly impactful one. And I think building on what Sarah is saying, the idea of doing that questionnaire or even simply, interviews. And we often talk about doing problem discovery interviews or customer discovery interviews where you're just speaking to people across the organization fundamentally to find out, what are the problems they're facing? How are they currently approaching it? How effective is the current approach? What would they like to see to change to be able to really kind of go into that discovery mode? And often what we find is we like to rush to solutions. Yes. And so the important thing to do when you're having those discovery conversations is not to solutionize, right? It's not to, that a moment someone tells you something to go, well, actually there's a course for that, or there's a training program we get. That's not what that's about, right? I think it's really about focusing on, you're just there to listen, right? Listen, gather, reflect on it, and go away and really analyze it. And so you're not in solution mode. You're purely there to kind of discover. And I also think it's a great way for L&D teams to get to know the business, right? And to really, it's one of those great roles where you're not really siloed to the functional team you belong to, right? You can get to know business stakeholders and collaborators across the organization. And I think the problem discovery interviews and the questionnaire is a great way of engaging these other stakeholders and partners and collaborators and really trying to get to the root of the problem.
No, I love that. I absolutely love that. You mentioned all of that, and coming back to, just partnering with the other parts of the business is so critical in developing any type of high impact learning culture. And you hit the nail on the head when you said every company has a learning culture, but whether it's high impact, positive, negative, maybe in some cases detrimental, that is all to be determined in that analysis phase. And sometimes, and we're all guilty of this. We all love what we do. We all have a lot of pride in our work. And sometimes when we come in with that solution, I have this resource, or I have this training, and we're treating a symptom, but we're not really treating the root cause of it, right? And so the other thing about analysis work is that, I loved what you said, Gary, about numbers and getting that qualitative data as well as the quantitative data, because quantitative data, while immensely valuable, can be misleading in a lot of ways and can be interpreted differently in a lot of ways. Whereas when someone is sitting there telling you, I don't like how we're learning, but they're performing well, then that gives a missing piece of the puzzle, right? For instance, a lot of businesses see that, was looking at statistics recently about, training and whatnot, and 21% increase can be had in a business's profits by having a high impact learning culture. And so companies see that and are like, hiring an L&D team, magic bullet, it's all going to be fantastic. We're automatically going to have this great culture. And And then the flip side of that coin is companies can lose up to $500 billion in poor L&D development and implementation in teams. So that's why learning culture is so pivotal and important. And it's not just an L&D team's responsibility. It is a corporation business-wide responsibility. But in order to get anywhere with that, we have to come with that information from a business lens. How is our ROI impacted? How can this really give me more money? And how can I do it for cheaper, right? So, once you have done all the analytics, it's important to bring that whole picture to the different teams and your executive leadership and say, we can do all of these things, but without these, like, if you think of it like a machine, right? Like, we can make these wheels turn in the machine, but if these cogs don't turn as well, all of this will have little to no impact, and you won't see the return on investment, which could ultimately be that 21%, right? Which is what we want to see. We want to see less attrition. We want to see higher performance rates. We want to see higher morale. And all of that does have learning culture that stems into it. But that learning culture by itself is not enough of an ingredient to make the whole cake.
No, yeah, definitely makes sense. I think something you spoke about there is taking it to other people, the message that you're trying to convey. And something we spoke about before was how you just boil down the sort of core of your strategy and your learning culture that you're proposing and communicate it to people in sort of as little slides or documents as possible so that they can really understand the value. So sort of in your experience, how important is it to do that well? And sort of why do we need to do it? How can we do it?
So I would say that is a pivotal part in your presentation for learning culture and establishing the buy-in. Is just like in a learning, you have to know your audience. And if your audience is your executive leadership, you could sit there all day and talk about, oh, learning this and learning that, and I, learn that, nerd out and all that, but they're not going to feel it in the same way that a learning professional would. What they want to know is, how is my bottom dollar impacted? It says I get a 21% increase. Why am I not getting that 21%, right? So showing those tangible gaps and bringing it really back to the business itself is going to be so important. And so when we talk about, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at, I'm finding a specific thing I wanted to mention from one of the documents. I did a lot of research about this when I was going through this implementation. But it's so important that learning culture is linked to outcomes such as job satisfaction and motivation for learning, and to understand that people who are not getting their Maslow's needs met, they're not going to be getting learning in any sort of way. If morale's already low, you're going to have to develop that and find a way to tap into what's going on there. So it may be way deeper than what people are willing to acknowledge at the time. So when you're talking to your audiences, it's really important that you come with it not as an attack or saying, hey, these things are missing and this is broken, but coming with solutions and saying, here's how we can improve it. We noticed that we have lower performance over here. So some ideas for that would be putting in place some manager support. Here's how we're going to do A, B, and C from the learning side to help support those managers feeling empowered to be able to support their people. So really coming with a plan of attack for who your audience is to get to, and what that leads to ROI wise. So from my end, what we first did, we identified and outlined the current learning culture, right? We identified the key stakeholder groups that we would be presenting to because we have to know our audience. Then we identified and outlined, what does the ideal learning culture look like here? here's where we're at. Now, what does everyone envision that ideal learning culture to be, given that learning culture is XYZ? So again, that's all done during that analysis phase. Then kind of analyzing and defining the needs of the target core users that you're looking to, or target core audience that you're looking to really at the end of the day improve all this for, so that we see the return on investment. And then aggregate all of that data of associated performance metrics, because all of this leads back to performance. Every single thing that we do in learning leads back to performance metrics and trends, and see where those trends and that performance data is affected by learning culture, right? If we're seeing over here that, oh, we don't have X, Y, and Z training for their job. Did you know that 77% of employees do not feel like they have all the skills needed to do their job? That's insane, right? That's such a high number. They want to learn more. They want to be able to do more, but they don't feel empowered to be able to do more. And just throwing training at it, again, that's a symptom of the root cause, which could be maybe there's not enough time to do the training. Maybe a development of the training needs to be tackled, so there's a whole bunch of that we'll dig into. But so once we've done all that, we can do that through the SWOT analysis and the survey that we mentioned earlier, then creating a comprehensive deck that you can then pull slides out of. So with your target audiences in mind. So you look at all the questions you kind of want to answer. So what is learning culture? Why does it matter? Indicators of a successful learning culture pulled from industry research. There are 7 dimensions of learning culture that are broken down for that. What is the current state of the learning culture? So again, that's pulling those results and metrics from all the analytic research that you had done prior and pulling that into slides. Why is this the current state? So that's going to be that anecdotal information that you gathered as well. Then what is needed to change it? There are very specific actions that you want to say, yes, this is what it is right now. It's okay, because here are the steps that we can take to change it. I'm going to give Nelson and Gary a couple different links to some different resources that have some steps that target specific gaps in learning culture to have after this session. Then again, the proposed actions to change it. So what is needed to change it? That's going to be the high level industry standards, like, hey, we need manager support. We need to have more investment in learning time blocks for our employees to actually complete the training and do their administrative work separately, right? Because that's a big thing. We have competing priorities. How do we make this a priority? And then how are we going to do those things would come next. So proposed actions to actually change it. Here's, so what are the needs, specific actions, goal improvement, ROI, and value add for each of those things? How will that improvement be measured? So what are going to be your methods for tracking? Are you looking at performance data? Are you looking at the amount of times that they mentioned, hey, you need to take this training? Are you looking at how much marketing was used for specific training initiatives and manager involvement, and then performance trends, and seeing how they all link together? Because linking your data sets are going to be pivotal. And then how does this plan, most importantly, in my opinion, I mean, I think it's all important, but most importantly, in my opinion, how does this plan support our OKRs, our objective key results, and link it back to everything that the business is trying to achieve? Because without that final piece, everything else kind of falls flat for your target audience of your executive leadership. And then of course, the potential roadblocks. From there, depending if you're talking to like higher ups, or if you're talking like you want it to parse it down to just like what's the problem? How do we fix it? Here's the OKRs, like 3 slides. If you're talking to leadership that's going to help get this over the finish line, you're going to have more of that granular data and you can link out to it. I think a big thing that L&D professionals really struggle with is parsing down their information. I know, I know that's something I struggle with. Maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but I always feel better when I link out to, if they have any questions, I have that link ready to go. I have that link ready to go. So I don't feel like I'm leaving it off the page, but I am leaving it off the page so it can be there if needed. But if it's not needed, I'm good to go.
Yeah, I would say that like when you see how much has to go into outlining a good strategy, you're right. If you take it to a CEO or someone high up, Nelson, they'll only really be interested in why is this not working at the moment? What are the actions we need to take, and what are the potential outcomes and problems we're going to solve? So I guess it is a case of how do you capture that in a succinct fashion? So like we recently submitted some award summaries in the form of slides, but realistically, judges for award ceremonies are going to receive hundreds of applications, right? So really, it was kind of 2 decks in one. The first 5 slides was everything someone needed to know. And if they didn't look past that point for more context, then that was okay. They would still understand the problem, the pain point, and the way we solved it. But yeah, Nelson, what are your thoughts on sort of capturing this? I know you've had some good response to the learning canvas framework from the book. So maybe we can sort of explain that to people a bit.
Yeah, I think with all of the kind of building blocks that Sara is talking about kind of reminds me of what we discussed around kind of first principles approach, right? Is when you think about an L&D strategy, sometimes it can feel like a very big thing that's abstract. And where do you start? Where do you end? How do I communicate? Who should collaborate and contribute to this? And it can feel like there's a lot of moving parts. And this is where I think applying first principle thinking, which essentially means just boiling things down to their fundamental truths and building blocks. And a lot of those what Sara just covered, and you know, the ones I picked out in the learning canvas are essentially 9 building blocks that cover a lot of what was mentioned earlier. But those 9 building blocks come together to tell you the why, how, and what of your learning strategy. So you know, your first 3 blocks that kind of define the why is what's the problem you're trying to solve. So in this case, what's the business challenge that you're trying to solve? And then who's the target customer? So, you know, who are the people that you need to solve this challenge for to see the kind of desired outcome? And the third block in that trio is the value proposition. So when you solve this problem for this internal customer, this is the value you add. And that's really critical, because the value proposition is both the value for the employee and the value for the organization, right? And that value proposition is what motivates both parties to invest their time, energy, and resources in engaging in the first place, right? Otherwise, the organization has no reason to give you a budget, and the employee has no reason to invest their time in engaging with your learning experiences. So those 3 blocks would define your value proposition. And then the next 3 is around how. So you've got the why, and now the how would be made up of what's the solution. And an important one to point out here, the solution is not your course or your learning experience or your training program, right? That might be a form in which your solution manifests itself. But the solution is really what's the knowledge, skills, and mindset that's required to solve the business challenge that you spoke about, right? So let's say, for example, the skill is negotiation, right? And so that's the skill that you need this target customer to, your internal customer to have. Then that might manifest itself in different forms, right? It could be a course, it could be a training program, it could be a podcast, right? It could be a job aid. And then the other part of it is key partners and stakeholders, like Sara mentioned earlier, around who are the partners and stakeholders, both internally and externally, who are going to help you create that solution. And the last one is the key resources. This is where you now talk about, okay, do you need a learning platform? Do you not need a learning platform? Do you need a course? Do you need resources? This is where you define what are those key resources that are going to help you connect the solution to your internal customer. The final 3 blocks are your what, right? What do you measure to know whether this strategy is working, not working? And this is made up of 3 blocks. The first block being key metrics, right? So key metrics are engagement metrics. Now, it's important to point out here, often L&D teams stop with key metrics. Now, key metrics is not the outcome. Key metrics are just early indicators that tell you people are engaging, right? So that might be views, completion rate, likes, comments. So all of these early signals, and don't have too many, right? I typically recommend anywhere between 1 to 3 key metrics that are leading indicators that there's some engagement happening, because engagement is the primary requirement for any learning to take place, but it's not the only requirement, right? If people are not engaging, nothing else is going to follow. And then you have outcome. Now, this, like what Sara was mentioning, this is the performance outcome. Why are you doing this? So the outcome is a very specific, measurable metric that shows you the value proposition has been delivered, right? So if your value proposition is a statement, your outcome is a way of measuring that statement has been achieved. And then your final block is cost, right? So how much is it going to cost you to deliver this learning and development strategy? And quite simply, I often speak to L&D professionals who struggle with talking about ROI. It's quite simply the outcome box minus the cost box gives you your ROI. If the cost box is bigger than your outcome box and you're not achieving it, that means you're not bringing in return. So all of these 9 blocks are on a single page on the learning canvas. And the reason why it's a single page, it makes it easier for you to be able to collaborate, discuss ideas, debate by looking at this one page. But also once you've got it down, it makes it easier to communicate to the rest of the business, right? So I'm no longer flicking through slides or flicking through pages of a plan. I've got a single page that tells me what the fundamental building blocks are of my learning strategy. And one last thing to really kind of point out there is each of these blocks, like Sara mentioned earlier, they're often hypotheses or assumptions, right? You don't know for sure that this solution is going to solve your problem. And so what you're doing is you're testing and iterating on each one of those blocks, right? So if you try out one version and you realize it's not moving you in the direction of your desired outcome, then tweak different blocks. Maybe it's the key resource, right? Maybe it's the engagement metric. Maybe it's the solution. Maybe you've got the complete wrong problem. And so the whole idea of it is the canvas is not set in stone, right? Because there's a lot of assumptions baked into it. What you need to now do is to implement this strategy and learn from the feedback and iterate on that.
No, so you just solved one of the biggest questions people struggle to answer about ROI in about 10 seconds. It's true though. It's those two simple things, isn't it? Is that what's the cost and what's the outcome, and that whichever way it's going on that case will point you in the right direction. And we've got the learning canvas as a document that we can send out in the show notes as well to people that should be useful. But Sara, any thoughts on what Nelson just said there before we move on to the other topics?
Yeah, no, I think a one-pager is going to be really impactful, especially for those higher ups that you're looking to communicate with. I would also say that for your value proposition and thinking about the motivational factors, think about what are the different facets of those motivational factors and how far they're removed from the different audiences that you're selling it to. So most people, when we're in a job, we're like, how do we make more money? How do I, we're all about the money. And that's what a business is thinking about, and especially executives. So if the business makes more money, then I make more money and I get to keep my job. That's kind of a cool bonus. But, we definitely want to think that while yes, this may be like the overarching motivational factor that's driving everyone, what are the different facets that people can find an intrinsic or even extrinsic, motivational factor to play into that overarching one? The other thing that I really just wanted to emphasize is the solution part that you were talking about, Nelson, is it's not one solution, right? You have to build the environment. And I think when we talk about learning culture, we're thinking, oh, well, we'll just put this in place and we'll put this in place and put this in place. And ta-da, we have a learning culture. And that means that, everybody is taking X amount of trainings and they're viewing it this many times and whatnot, and that equals engagement. But we really have to think about, is the learning environment conducive for learning? Learning happens when we're slightly uncomfortable and we know it's safe to be uncomfortable and try and make mistakes, right? So really getting to a place where that is non-toxic is a huge, huge thing, because oftentimes we're like, okay, well, did you do it becomes a culture of compliance versus a culture of learning. And so when we think about engagement, to really think about, okay, well, they're sitting here, but are they getting questions correct? Are they interested in what we're talking about? Do I need to pivot? And getting, again, like Gary mentioned, like we've been mentioning throughout, that anecdotal support and evidence for, yes, these are what the numbers are saying, but what is the feeling? What is the person behind this learning? So we understand, is this truly hitting the holistic picture of how learning happens and occurs? Also loved that you talked about what's driving the need for learning culture. What does drive the need for learning culture? Like, why are we doing it? Well, for instance, this project came about in my last position because they wanted to implement a learning experience platform at LXP. An LXP is different than an LMS in that it is learner driven, and it kind of flips the pyramid of how we access and pursue learning to meet our professional and career goals. LMS, it's like, okay, it's more compliance culture. This is what we're going to do. LXP is moving more towards that learning culture and let me explore and develop as a person. We're going to invest in our employees. They see that they want to invest in themselves because they want to progress in their careers. And therefore, they're going to give more back to the business. It's kind of like this self-feeding entity, right? So when we were looking at all this stuff for implementing an LXP, a lot of what drives that is having that need and space for learning and time for learning that our associates did not have. And that was something that we needed to really champion and procure prior to even trying to implement an LXP, because they were looking at an LXP as this is the solution, this is how we're going to get what we need, but they weren't putting the correct blocks in place to set it up for a successful digital transformation and adoption. Which this is why unsuccessful learning cultures can lead to losses of billions of dollars, right? And they're not going to see that 21%. So when we think about the cost of developing that learning culture, right, it can seem overwhelming. But if you use initiatives that are already in place, you're going to be doing yourself and the business and everyone else a huge favor, because you already have learning initiatives. You already have, let's say you have a promotional, like a big promotion coming up if you're a retail company and they need to get X amount of deals or service deals done within this amount of time during that peak window, right? So during that time, think about what the business does to push those things. They use marketing, they use their communications, they're going to use all of these kind of incentivizing factors to drive that. You can kind of infuse different techniques for developing learning culture, like 86% of people are more likely to take a training if their direct manager recommends they do it and actually buys into the fact that they should do it. That's a huge percent. But if you have some teams really performing and other teams that you notice, wow, they're really not performing, and you go in, you listen to one of their meetings and they're like, oh, you don't have to worry about that training. I just need you to hit these numbers, hit these numbers, hit these numbers. That's going to lead to lower morale. That's going to lead to people not worrying about the training or placing any emphasis on it. So during that peak time, use that time to really say, hey, managers, we're really going to push this training along with this peak, like right before this peak, because it's part of getting ready for it, right? So it's a very low lift option to develop just a little bit more emphasis and starting to build that value in learning, that what can it bring for me? And it might start extrinsically, but then this is the most important part from going from extrinsic to an intrinsic motivator is, let's say, okay, every time you mention this, write a little tally and we'll see which manager mentions it the first, or every time you mention it, your name gets put in a hat for a drawing or whatever. They do that. And then you show them the numbers from the last promotional and then the numbers from this promotional with the same training initiative, but because they promoted it, say, see how much better your teams did, and so they start to see how actually that impact is trickling down. And that's what's going to start to build the learning culture. If you just try and teach it, it's like, again, learning in the flow of work. Everybody loves that little bit of buzzwordiness, is you're going to infuse learning culture within the work that you're already doing. You're not going to go out of your way to try and build learning culture. You're just going to build on existing.
Yeah. Nelson, I really wanted to bring you in on this point, actually, because Sara nailed it earlier on. It's about how do you build the environment, but to what extent does the environment already exist in terms of the culture? So I guess in some ways, it's just about as much spotting organic behaviors and then using them to inform the culture rather than it is to make wholesale changes, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's important to almost go back to the kind of culture and learning culture. And often I've seen people, when we're talking to organizations about culture, they kind of roll their eyes, and culture, and some people look at it like almost a fluffy term where it's just around what they put up on the wall, or what's on their About Us page on their website. But actually, culture is simply put shared behavior, right? It's just what we do. This is how we do things, right? And so it isn't that abstract. It isn't that fluffy. It's just a way of summing up how we do things. And your learning culture, as an extension of that, is how we learn, but also what do we do with what we learn, right? It's not just a case of I went on a training or I learned something from a colleague. But then, like Sara said, do I have the psychological safety to try this without the fear of repercussion to my career, right? I can make those mistakes and I can learn from those mistakes and I can apply it again. And so that's how you can incorporate it. And it reminds me of something we talk about often, Gary, around the kind of fish out of water. And when you focus on any single magic bullet, right, where it could be the learning platform, it could be content, what you're doing is you're focusing on the fish but not the water. And much like how fish out of water doesn't really last, your water is your context, it's everything else. And it's how you do promotions, it's what do you reward, how do you give feedback, what do you do with feedback, what are the job roles, all of these different moving parts need to be taken into account when developing a learning strategy, and as an extension, the learning experience. And that's how you can, learning in the flow of work really is just how do we incorporate these moments of learning into work? And that's why it could be as simple as, even if the one thing we take away from today is at the end of a meeting, just having 5 minutes at the end where we ask each other on the meeting, what could I have done better in that meeting? And then me giving you feedback, you giving me feedback. That's learning in the flow of work, right? Now, I didn't have to go away on a 2-day offsite to go come back and improve that feedback. And I think, like Sara said, it's those incorporating that learning. We talk about time. And I think on LinkedIn's survey for the last 3 or 4 years, time has been one of the biggest barriers, top 3 barriers for people to learn. And now, look, you can either take this as people being overworked and it's not being prioritized, or that could have some truth. Another way of looking at it is also, if there was relevant learning that was available in those moments that matter, wouldn't people make time? Like, I don't know anyone who schedules in time to go search on Google. You go to Google because you have a moment of need. The need motivates you to go there. you search, you find something, you apply it, it creates a positive feedback loop. So the next time you need something, you go back to Google search. Now, if you are serving up relevant content in those moments that matter, then I will be motivated because I know I can apply it and transfer it to what I'm doing in my day-to-day work. And I'm not too sure many L&D teams can say that's what's happening in their organization.
No.
But I would say it's hard to do that though, right? Because we're also battling a long history of the teach and preach, and this is how training is done. And so that's part of developing your learning culture, is starting to advocate for that type of learning. So now we're seeing things like digital adoption platforms like WalkMe, WhatFix, and whatnot, that when they're actually going through parts of the platform, they get a little snippet of learning just on the little thing that they need. The 5 moments of need, Bob Mosier, I love that stuff. So really just taking advantage of those little things instead of that, let me remove you from the environment that you would actually be applying this in, put you into a sterilized room full of people who don't want to be there and all they can think about is that big project they have to work on, right? And then expect you to learn. And again, that goes back to really thinking about, they're too removed, thinking about the circle of motivations and what is applicable now, like Julie Dirksen with the elephant, right? Is what is applicable now, what is applicable in the future, how far removed is it from that person doing the learning? And sometimes, unfortunately, that boils back down to, do the designers have, and the L&D department actually have the freedom to implement learning best practices within the flow of work? Or is that something you're still trying to balance while building this culture, is change management? I think that's something we don't talk about enough in L&D, is change management 101. And when we try and say, okay, well, we're going to go from a full week of in-person training for onboarding, and we're just going to have a digital adoption walkthrough as they go through it for their first week, and we'll just have an hour-long session where we introduce them to everything and everybody gets this. People will freak out. They will it's too much change. It's like I said, people learn and are willing to accept when they're just slightly uncomfortable, slightly uncomfortable. And when they feel like it's a safe environment, when you have that, so many factors that have changed, that is not comfortable, that is not safe, it is unknown. And it goes back to our biology. It goes back to that initial, like, it takes us 7 seconds to make a split hair decision about, we encountered this person. Who are they? Are they a threat? Are they safe? It kicks in our fight or flight. And it determines how we engage and interact, because we are categorizing it with other experiences of our life. So if you think about an adult learner who's gone through all of these different experiences in life, when there's a big change like that, oftentimes it's resulted in failure. And that's because the support mechanisms weren't in place for it. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of, we think this is going to fail. It's going to fail. I'm not going to bother. We just need to stick with what's been done because it hasn't failed as bad as I think this is going to. So we really need to. Yep, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Sarah, it's ironic that you say we don't talk about change management that much, because learning is change, right? So we're all in the business of change, yet we don't talk about change management when we're trying to change our playbook or and the difficult thing is, we talk a lot about exponential change and how we underestimate the rates at which the world is changing. And I think if we're still underestimating it after the last 3 years that we've been through, then when we really are delusional. But in that exponential change, the question is really, would incrementally tweaking your current playbook, is it really sufficient, right? And if your playbook, if you're an organization today where your L&D function is only responsible for compliance and that is all you do, then unfortunately, the reality is you're so far behind right now. You have to do something drastic. Like almost throw out your current playbook and write a new one to be able to catch up. And I think we've seen this, and with the idea of new companies that are winning in markets, and companies have been around winning for so long, now all of a sudden losing market. All examples of companies where it's no longer enough to rest on your laurels, and the old things that were working for you are not the things that are going to keep you where you are today.
No, I 1,000% agree with everything you just said. I really do. I think, when this comes back to looking at the water and not just the fish, though. If we want to, right? And I'm picking up the lingo here. I'm picking it up. But if we want to do a drastic change like that, then we have to make sure that change threshold in other areas of business is not already saturated by other changes. Because if so, it's going to be too overwhelming. It's going to be too much. So what I would be very strategic in where to make those drastic implementations of change. Look for your quick wins. Look for your surefire wins. Do 1 or 2 of those real quick. Show them, hey, look, we asked you to do something really different. Look how it paid off. You need those to be wins, those very first ones. And then from there, that's where it's going to feel comfortable to do other drastic changes. So if you're going to go with that approach, you have to look for where your wins are, and you have to time it super strategically while taking in the rest of the business acumen into account. Like, where are we at as a business? Where are we at as an organization? And is that space there for us to take? And can we get other people on board to pause any other big change initiatives while we do this one? So that's why cross-functional cooperation is so, so important. And I love what you said about exponential. We look at the big picture. This is where we're going. Let's get there. Sometimes we aren't as intentional with our incremental changes as we should be. I think we can see exponential change if we have it laid out and plan out those incremental changes and set the expectation and cadence. This is what we're going to do on this date. This is what we're going to do on this date. And take what you were saying with those drastic changes and infuse it into that strategy and ramp those up to happen more often towards the end of that exponential change to get there faster. For sure.
Nelson, I think that comes back to this idea of positive feedback loops. Like, if we can show that our actions are having a positive impact in a short period of time, then the cultural change can be managed better, because we're not starting with a big bang idea that then possibly doesn't work or takes a long time to get off the ground. And I know you also mentioned about the Learning Flywheel in the book that might be useful for people here as well.
Yeah, it's almost looking at learning as a flywheel, and that's made up of 2 loops. So I see it almost as one loop, which is the learning experience design loop, which is often where the L&D professionals are working on, which is then connected to another loop, which is the learning experience loop, which is the learner's loop. Right. And both of these loops are intertwined, because, if you look at a learning experience loop and imagine it is, learn, practice, and then feedback. That feedback is not just feedback back to the learner, but it's also learner providing feedback back to you about the learning experience, right? Because if it didn't help them, then that's feedback. If it did help them, that's feedback. Then that feedback feeds into the learning experience design loop, which is, for me, made up of ideate, build, and test. So the ideate part is where you've got this feedback data, and now you're making a choice on, do I iterate or do I pivot? And that's really important, because we've just spent the last few minutes talking about incremental change. But sometimes it does require to throw out what you've got and completely pivot. And too often that doesn't happen, or it happens too late. And so it's important to have that intentional conversation to look at the feedback and say, are we moving in the right direction? Do we have some signals from the feedback that parts of it are working, parts of it not, so we can iterate on this? Or is it actually not showing any signs that this is solving the right problem or moving us in the right direction? So we've got to throw it out and we've got to pivot and now create a whole new learning experience. And then this loop starts again, where you go to build, then you go to test it. To test it, you put it out to your target customers. They go through to their learning loop. That spits out feedback. Now, the reason why I think it's a flywheel, Gary, like you said, I think when you're much like a flywheel, when you're trying to get a flywheel moving in the early stages, it's quite hard, right? The momentum is quite slow. But with a flywheel, what happens is the more with every turn, it builds momentum and it goes faster. It's the same is true for the learning flywheel. And the thing that makes that momentum go faster is the feedback loop, right? Is you get this feedback, now you're going to iterate, which moves you closer, and more feedback gets you closer and closer and closer. And every time you're getting closer, that flywheel turns faster and faster. And I think the mistake we would make is if in the early days of the flywheel, because it seems challenging, it's slow, it's not getting us results straight away, we stop turning the flywheel, right? We go through the loop once, twice, get the feedback, it's not working, and we stop going through that flywheel. And I think if we looked at it that way, we would accept that it's completely fine for the first few turns of those loops to be challenging and difficult, because that's when you know the least, right? That's when you've got a ton of assumptions in your learning strategy. You don't know if your learning experience is going to solve the problem or not. So it makes sense. It's going to be harder to turn that flywheel because you know the least. But with every turn, you know more. You know more about what works and what doesn't work, which helps you turn that flywheel faster.
I think with I love that analogy. Would have never thought to use that. I think with that is, how to get that flywheel turning faster and most effectively is thinking about types of feedback and really using the information that's there first. So instead, unfortunately, you know what they say about assuming, but we do it a lot, unfortunately. And when we do that, we don't always take into account what we could leverage from existing. And we always try and recreate the wheel. So to get that flywheel kind of going faster is really take in perceptions from what's there and use what they're used to start building ideas. And then I think a key part of that feedback loop that sometimes we forget to provide is why we're making the decision to keep or throw out, that is supported with evidence and data, so that our learners still trust us. If we're asking them to pivot and change, and we just went through this training, but we're asking you to go through this training next, why was this not effective? And being transparent with our learners, because oftentimes then we run the risk of going through a change fatigue if we are not communicative and transparent about what our learnings were. Here's how we're going to fix it moving forward. Here's how we're addressing it, either through an iteration or a redo. So I love that.
And I think it goes back to the learning culture, right? Because the learning culture is not just for the L&D team, are also learners, right? And so I think if you have the right kind of learning culture, you have an audience that is willing to accept that, look, we're learning about learning, right? We're learning about what works and what doesn't work. And so in the same way, you need the psychological safety to try things out, get it wrong and learn from it. As a learning team, we're trying things out and trying to understand what works, what doesn't work, so we can help you better. And I think, again, it goes back to where we started. If you have that learning culture, and it's not just the L&D team, the organization operates in that kind of learning culture, then you have more openness to each team, not just the L&D team. You have more openness to every team experimenting and trying new things.
Yeah, love it.
That brings us nicely to the end of the show. So thank you so much, Sara, for joining Nelson and myself today. Like I said, if you're listening to the recording of this, the link to submit your questions for the next episode, where we'll be asking Nelson anything, will be in the show notes. And hopefully we'll see you all there. But Sara, thanks again. And hopefully we'll have you again on soon.